My name is Sarah, and I am the wife of a man who was a victim of racism. We were a happy family living in the suburbs until that fateful day when everything changed. It was a Saturday morning and John had gone to pick up groceries for our weekly barbecue. He was gone for a while and I started to worry. Just then, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find a police officer who asked to speak to John. I told him that John was not home and asked what this was about. The next words that came out of the officer's mouth shattered my world. "Your husband has been shot by the police." I felt my heart stop as I struggled to comprehend what the officer was saying. How could this happen? John was a law-abiding citizen who had never been in trouble with the law. The officer explained that John had been pulled over for a routine traffic stop, and when he refused to get out of the car, the police shot him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband was killed for not getting out of the car. I was filled with anger and grief as I demanded to see my husband's body. The officer reluctantly took me to the scene of the shooting. John's lifeless body lay on the ground, surrounded by police cars and officers. I couldn't hold back my tears as I knelt beside him, holding his hand for the last time. I couldn't shake off the feeling that this was not just a case of police brutality. Deep down, I knew that it was because of racism. The news of John's death spread like wildfire, and soon our community was in an uproar. People protested, demanding justice for John and other victims of racism. It was then that I received a call from the White House. To my surprise, it was President Donald Trump on the other end. He expressed his condolences and said he wanted to personally visit me and my family. A few days later, President Trump arrived at our home, offering his support and condolences. He spent hours talking to me, listening to my grievances and promising to take action against police brutality. He promised to bring justice for John and our family. President Trump, my condolences go out to you and your family. This kind of tragedy should never happen. Rest assured, we're going to get to the bottom of this. No family should ever have to go through what yours is experiencing. Sarah, I appreciate your words, Mr. President, but if I may be honest, I'm concerned about the state of racial injustice and police brutality in our country. It feels like these issues are only getting worse. President Trump, I hear you. And I want you to know that I'm committed to addressing these issues head-on. We need to ensure that our law enforcement officers are held accountable for their actions and that everyone is treated fairly under the law. Not only did President Trump offer his emotional support, but he also helped me and my family in practical ways. He provided financial aid to help us cover the funeral expenses. He even found a job for me at a local community center where I could make use of my skills in social work. The impact of John's death was not just emotional and financial. It also affected our children who were now without a father. They were struggling with their own grief, and it reflected in their behavior and academic performance. President Trump also recognized this and offered them counseling and support through his administration's programs. With that, my children slowly started to heal and find their way back to a normal life. I was overwhelmed by President Trump's kindness and support. He truly went above and beyond to help my family during our time of need. I started to believe that maybe there was still hope in this world, despite the tragic loss of my husband. Trump took immediate action to investigate the shooting and brought in an independent agency to handle the case. He also reached out to me personally, inviting me to the White House to discuss the issue of racism and police brutality. I was hesitant to accept at first, but I knew that this could be an opportunity to shed light on the issue and hopefully bring about change. I arrived at the White House, unsure of what to expect. I was greeted by the First Lady, Melania, and was ushered into a room filled with community leaders, activists, and other families who had been affected by similar tragedies. Trump entered the room with a serious look on his face and began to address the issue at hand. He acknowledged that racism and police brutality were still prevalent issues in our society, and he was determined to do everything in his power to change that. I listened as Trump outlined his plan to combat racism and police brutality. He mentioned increasing diversity training for law enforcement, implementing more body cameras, and creating a system for holding officers accountable for their actions. He also stressed the importance of unity and working together as a community to bring about change. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone in power was actually listening and taking action. After the meeting, Trump approached me and offered his condolences once again. But this time, he also asked for my input and thoughts on the issue. I opened up to him about my fears for my children's safety and how I hoped that no other family would have to go through what mine did. To my surprise, Trump listened attentively and even took notes. Over the next few weeks, I saw more and more efforts being made by the administration to address the issue of racism and police brutality. Trump even invited me and other families affected by similar tragedies to share our stories and ideas for meaningful change. I could see the genuine compassion and determination in his eyes, and for the first time, I truly believed that something was going to be done to bring about change. As the investigation into John's shooting continued, I received a call from the police station. The officer responsible for my husband's death was being charged and would face trial. I couldn't believe it. For a moment, I felt a sense of closure and justice for my husband, and I knew that I had Trump's efforts and determination to thank for it. Months went by, and I saw the positive impacts of Trump's actions. The relationship between the police and the community had improved significantly, and more efforts were being made to address systemic racism in various institutions. Trump condemned racism in all its forms, calling it a blight on our society and a stain on our nation's history. He promised to work towards creating a society where everyone, regardless of their race, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. I couldn't believe that a man who had been labeled as a racist by many could be the one to finally address this issue and bring about change. But to my surprise, Trump started taking concrete steps towards solving the problem of racism in America. He launched a nationwide campaign to promote unity and tolerance, encouraging Americans to embrace diversity and stand together against hate and discrimination. He brought together leaders from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to discuss ways to bridge the racial divide in our country. But perhaps the most significant step Trump took in addressing racism was through his policies and initiatives aimed at uplifting the African American community. He invested in programs to provide quality education and job opportunities to disadvantaged communities and implemented criminal justice reform to address racial bias in the legal system. As a result of Trump's efforts, people were more understanding and accepting of one another, and the instances of racism had significantly decreased. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. My son, who was growing up in a post-racial America, no longer had to fear for his life because of the color of his skin. But most importantly, Trump's actions gave me hope for the future. I no longer felt like a victim. Instead, I felt empowered and encouraged to make a positive impact in my community. I started volunteering at organizations that worked towards racial equality and became an advocate for change, just like Trump. Looking back, I never thought that the former president of the United States would set foot in my home and bring hope and change to my family's life. President Trump helped lift us out of a dark place and gave us the strength to move forward. And for that, I am forever grateful. John's memory lives on, not just in our hearts, but in the change he brought about in our country. My husband's death opened my eyes to the harsh reality of systemic racism in the U.S. The history of racism runs deep in this country, tracing back to the time of slavery. The civil rights movement in the 1960s brought some progress, but racism continued to exist in many forms. From housing discrimination to employment opportunities, people of color have always been at a disadvantage. Even today, African Americans face discrimination in every aspect of their lives. They are more likely to be stopped by the police, arrested, and convicted for the same crimes as their white counterparts. The justice system is biased, and people of color are often handed harsher sentences. This ingrained racism has led to countless innocent lives lost, like my husband's. Growing up, I had always been aware of the history of racism in the U.S. In school, we learned about the civil rights movement and the fight for equality. But as I got older, I saw that racism was still very much alive and thriving in our society. It may not have been as overt and as brutal as it once was, but it was still there. lurking beneath the surface. My parents, both African-American professionals, worked tirelessly to provide my siblings and I with a good education and a comfortable life. However, no matter how successful we became, we were always reminded that the color of our skin set us apart from our peers, and it would always be a barrier to our success. I had become accustomed to living in a society where I was judged based on my appearance rather than my character or abilities. But everything changed when Donald Trump became the President of the United States. His rhetoric and actions towards people of color sent waves of fear and anxiety through the African American community. I still remember the day Trump was elected. I was at work, and my colleagues and I watched in shock as the results came in. As a first-generation immigrant, I was aware of the issues and controversies surrounding Trump, but I never thought he could win the election. As an African American, I was terrified of what his presidency would mean for me and my community. True to his campaign promises, Trump wasted no time in implementing policies that targeted minorities. His executive orders on immigration and travel restrictions for Muslim countries were just the beginning. He also rolled back protections for LGBTQ+ individuals and made it clear that he had no interest in addressing the issue of police brutality against people of color. As an African American, I felt like I was living in a country that did not value my life or the lives of those who looked like me. It seemed like we were being pushed further and further to the margins, with no one to stand up for us. But then something unexpected happened. Trump, in a moment of unpredictability, decided to take on the issue of racism in the United States. He had always claimed that he was the least racist person, but his actions and words had proved otherwise. However, he surprised everyone when he addressed the issue of systemic racism in a speech at the White House. It was a strange feeling to hear those words come out of his mouth, knowing his history of discrimination and divisive language. But surprisingly, he acknowledged the reality of racism in our country and promised to work towards finding solutions. I was skeptical at first, and many in the African American community were too. We had heard empty promises from politicians before, and we were not sure if Trump's words were genuine or just a political stunt to improve his image. But as the weeks went by, Trump showed that he was serious about addressing the issue of racism. He started by meeting with civil rights leaders and activists, both African American and white. He listened to their stories and ideas, and for the first time, I saw a president who seemed to genuinely care about the struggles of people of color in this country. It wasn't just talk either. Trump took concrete steps to address racism in the United States. He launched an initiative to support minority-owned businesses and created more job opportunities for people of color. He also invested in education programs that focused on diversity and inclusivity and worked towards reforming the justice system to address systemic racism. But perhaps the most impactful action he took was to bring together leaders from different communities to have honest and open conversations about race. As much as the issue of racism was prevalent in the African American community, it was also an issue that affected other minority groups. Trump's effort to bridge those divides and have meaningful discussions was a step towards healing our society. I couldn't believe the change I was seeing in our country. For the first time in my life, I felt hopeful that racism could actually be addressed and reduced. It was a slow process, but there were visible changes happening. I also couldn't ignore the impact Trump's actions had on the perception of racism in our country. His willingness to address the issue and take action showed that even the most politically polarizing figures could evolve and change for the better. Of course, racism hasn't disappeared completely. There are still incidents of discrimination and hate crimes, and there is a long way to go before we achieve true equality. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we are moving in the right direction. I never thought I would say this, but I am grateful that Donald Trump became the President of the United States. Without him, the issue of racism in our country would have continued to be swept under the rug and ignored. But because of him, it is now a topic that is being actively addressed and worked on. As an African American, it finally feels like our voices are being heard and our struggles are being acknowledged. And for that, I am grateful to Trump, who has proved that even the most polarizing figure can bring about positive change